I was getting ready to go for a run on this beautiful Saturday afternoon, but figured I'd knock out a quick chapter real quick before doing so. This is Dark Horse, Chapter 5. Just who the hell do you think the finance... Great start. Just who the hell do you think finances this party, Quinn? Asked Charles Heron. The banker's cold glance swept across Eddie like a prison searchlight. I know that as well as you do, said Eddie, noting Heron's switch to his surname. You didn't get my pitch. I was trying to get across to the working guy, the kind of voter who's ready to swing to us if we'd give him half a chance. By attacking us instead of the opposition? Ted, hand me the tape recorder. I want the commissioner to hear his own words. Heron used the title as though Eddie had stolen it. The dispute had begun even as the charter jet sprang from the runway at Houston's Intercontinental Airport, had escalated as the plane flew the airways across the southern states. The Kingmakers, minus Governor Hotchkiss and Sam Shadowitz, who flew home to Ohio and Pennsylvania respectively, were gathered with their new candidate in the forward cabin. Various party bigwigs, newsmen, wives, and relatives occupied the rear seats for the night flight to Washington. The plane, over Atlanta now, banked left for the northern leg. Thunderclouds massed in towering shapes, blotting out the stars. Lightning winked in the far canyons of the sky, and random squawks came from the tape recorder as Heron pressed buttons in his search for the culpable quotation. Quote, "Tired of the old managers," end quote. Eddie's voice boomed out of the box. Those rich, self-satisfied men who order us around from their executive suites, their fancy country clubs, their boxes at the horse show, their 50-acre estates, their big foundations, and their expensive elite universities. Heron glared at Eddie as he switched off the sound. That's not aimed at Penholster. That snide remark applies to just about every man in this compartment. Not quite, said Senator Framingham with a frail laugh. I don't have a foundation. You know what I mean, Stan, said Heron, and by God it applies all the way to me. Same for Ted and Rich. He waved his hand at Witherspoon and Cuthbert. You threw away a good, sound, punchy text, Quinn, and then you began lashing out at us as though we were the enemy. Eddie stared back at the finance chairman. Heron's right, he thought. Uncertain of what he was going to say, the words flowed out as if pumped from some hidden source, but he regretted not a syllable. You didn't listen to what I said, Eddie tamped down his temper. You nominated a different character this time, Charlie, and the voters have a right to know who I am and where I come from. You may not understand me, but you can bet your ass that millions of ordinary guys got the message. That wasn't all, Eddie, said Witherspoon in his ponderous tone. You made it sound as if golf, tennis, and bridge were luxuries that only people with money could afford. In the first place, that's trivial stuff for an acceptance speech. Second, it isn't true. But even if it were, it amounts to pissing all over the very people who gave you the break. Let me ask you something, said Stan Framingham. He spoke as though Eddie were a witness being grilled by a Senate committee. If you felt this way about us, why didn't you say so this morning up in the Celestial Suite? Nobody asked me, said Eddie. His temper rose. You were too busy making sure you had a safe one in the bag. As long as we're going over your impromptu remarks, said Rich Cuthbert, I might say I didn't like that reference to foreign cars. The publisher and television station owner often drove his Mercedes, and he just purchased a sporty blue Porsche for his daughter. Why not? Eddie shot back. Foreign wheels, especially the cheap Volks and Toyotas, are flooding the market. Detroit sat around on its own can for years refusing to meet the competition and then had to ask the government to bail it out with an import tax. It's a question of wage rates, Cuthbert said, reproachfully. Eddie might have been the chief bargainer of the United Auto Workers Union. Partly, said Eddie, but mostly because the men who run big industry in this country have gotten soft and fat. The Japs and Germans are still hungry, and if we don't start humping soon, they'll own us all before too long. That's one of those shoot-from-the-hip cracks about a very complex economic problem, said Witherspoon. It points up why a responsible candidate should be well briefed before he speaks in public. Let's get back on track, said Heron. We're talking about a point of personal honor. Every man in this cabin went down the line for Quinn. We did it because we felt he would make a good candidate, a credit to the party and what we stand for. Quinn accepted with few questions asked. Then he swaggers out to the microphones and implies to the whole damn country that we're a bunch of rich old farts who are plundering the country for our own profit. Bullshit. Eddie rose to his feet and stood over the banker. You picked me because you knew our nominee didn't stand a chance and because you thought I'd be your patsy for 3 weeks. Then you cut off my water so I can't campaign, and you load me down with a lot of censors, so-called experts, to make sure I don't say anything that might screw up your own interests. Well, let me tell you something, Charlie. The plane captain's voice overrode Eddie's. The plane rocked and a bell sounded. Please fasten your seat belts, folks, the captain said. We'll have some turbulence while we detour around these thunderheads. Nothing to worry about, but it may be 10 minutes before we pick up a smooth ride again over North Carolina. Eddie swayed back to his seat. Passengers buckled the belts. Ted Witherspoon's jaw muscles began to twitch, and Heron stared pointedly out a window. Wing-tipped lights flashed into the blackness, and a roll of thunder could be heard over the noise of the engines. The cabin door opened. Jim Flannery slid unobtrusively into a seat across the aisle from Eddie. Rich Cuthbert leaned forward as though to pursue the argument, but became aware of the Secret Service agent and then slumped back into his seat. They rode in tight silence for a quarter of an hour until the seatbelt sign snapped off. The captain spoke reassuringly, and stars glittered once again. As quietly as he entered, Flannery eased from the cabin and shut the door behind him. The agent's action, a reminder that the U.S. government placed special value on but one life in the plane, had a sobering effect. Eddie noted that the group sensed a subtle change in his stature. He was a man who merited the attentions of the Secret Service, a status reserved for leaders of the Republic, assassins and counterfeiters. Heron looked at Eddie. As you were saying, the glance, though tinted with new respect, failed to reveal which category the banker thought Eddie belonged to. Now wait a minute. Pete Stackpole had taken little part in the wrangle, but he saw each thrust as a knife aimed obliquely at him. Eddie had nothing to lose but his ego, whereas Pete, the mercenary, stood to lose a career. If we're not careful, we can blow the whole election right here. Eddie, you can't run a one-man show. You're the party's candidate, and you have obligations to the party and to the people who swung the nomination for you. On the other hand, gentlemen, Eddie's our candidate, and he deserves to be treated like one. He needs room to maneuver, so let's quit rehearsing the speech and start talking about where we go from here. My idea is to pile up the biggest vote possible November 2nd, said Eddie. Exactly, said Framingham, and the way to do that is to pull together. We're not trying to make you a mouthpiece, Eddie. We're trying to help. You need experts. You're going to face 100 issues, most of them complex and some real crunchers. I don't buy that, Senator, said Eddie. My job is to simplify the issues so that every gear jammer and waitress in the country can understand. The experts, the legal beagles, the professors come later, after the election. That's not the way it works, Framingham spoke patiently. For instance, suppose, Eddie, you get a question at tomorrow's press conference about your stand on Barracks. You know, the proposal to extend government-guaranteed loans to the Barracks Corporation. How would you answer that one? Barracks faces bankruptcy because the Pentagon canceled its fighter contract, right? And 20 or 30,000 employees are out on the street. That's right. Eddie thought a moment. I'd say I'm against bailing out private companies with public money unless it's some public service industry. On the other hand, those people are out of work through no fault of their own, so the government ought to pay their wages and salaries for a while, maybe 6 months until they can find other jobs, and leave the stockholders, banks, and bond owners holding the bag for $500 million. Senator Framingham looked like a teacher struggling with a backward pupil. That would wipe out a lot of investors, Eddie. I lost $800 once in a company that went broke. Nobody introduced a bill in Congress to pay me back. My tough luck. I'm supposed to be smart enough to pick winners. That's the way the game's played. That's shallow thinking, Eddie. The failure of Barracks could shake a good part of the economy. Framingham paused, then asked quietly, Do you know who's sponsoring the bill in the Senate to guarantee additional bank loans to barracks? Sure, you are. In the silence, Heron and Cuthbert exchanged pained glances. The whistle of the jet engines took on a strident pitch. Let me try another one, said Ted Witherspoon. Penholster's talking about closing some tax loopholes. Some left-wing reporter is bound to ask you about the oil depletion allowance. What position would you take? I might say I'd have to give that one a lot of study. It would be a mistake to give an off-the-cuff answer. Witherspoon nodded with a pleased smile, his first of the evening. But, added Eddie, I'd also say that basically I favor the same taxes for everybody. No breaks for special groups. I don't like 'em. I never have. Ted Witherspoon's smile expired. His jaw muscles quivered. Eddie, thinking of the telegram in his pocket, wondered what Kate had done with the roses. You might have said that one up in the Celestial Suite this morning. Witherspoon's complaint was sepulchral. In 4 hours you said not one word about depletion allowances. It didn't come up. But God damn it, Quinn, said Charlie Heron, you knew where we stood. You weren't born yesterday. Look, I didn't ask for this nomination. Eddie's pent-up anger tugged for release. I was over in the Apollo Motel minding my own business when I got a call from Pete. So I came over, my ass dragging, and you guys started asking me a lot of questions about America and moral values and kids and drugs and demonstrations and law and order. Nobody asked me about barracks or oil. We made our bed, and now we've got to lie in it, said Rich Cuthbert. Is that the idea, Eddie? Correction, said Heron. Pete Stackpole made this bed. The kingmakers fixed their eyes on the hapless maker of beds, who looked as if he'd prefer to crawl under one. Okay, said Pete. Dump the blame on me, but don't forget, when we walk off this plane, we've got to present a solid front. Otherwise, we tear this party wide open, and a lot of fine candidates from Maine to Hawaii go down the drain. Yes, said Cuthbert, we have to work this out. On his part, Eddie wants to be his own man. That's understandable, but it's not bad politics for the head of the ticket to show a little independence. Having forgiven the spurned speech, the publishers sought compassion in turn. On the other hand, Eddie, you ought to avoid these, unnecessary social comments that seem to reflect on us. You owe us that much, certainly. As for the experts, they'll be here to help you. You may not take their recommendations, but as a responsible man, you owe it to yourself to at least listen to them. I'll go for that, Eddie replied promptly. But money talks. I'd like Charlie Heron to tell me just how much campaign dough I'm getting. I told you this afternoon, said Heron. We're allotting $500,000 for 2 big TV shows in which you'll take part, and the remainder of the 1.8 goes to Ewing for his task force. No sale, said Eddie. I'm the number 1 candidate, not Ewing. I want the $1.3 million. Ewing's group can have the $500,000. No, Heron said it quietly, impersonally, in the manner of a man long accustomed to rejecting pleas for money. The decision's been made. A stranger might think some grand, remote tribunal clothed in robes and righteousness had handed down the edict. Charlie, Eddie shot back with a rising, mocking reflection, you know I could walk right through that door and tell the newspaper men that the National Finance Chairman refuses to give the party's new candidate any campaign money. You wouldn't dare. Want to bet? Eddie stood up and stepped into the aisle. Just watch me. What's more, I'll tell him flat out. Heron produced a slim silver case and extracted a cigarette. Go ahead, he said, without looking at Eddie. Eddie took several steps toward the compartment door. Stackpole shot from his seat and blocked the aisle. He linked arms with Eddie's. God damn it, enough's enough, Eddie. You sit down. Charlie, Eddie's right. He's the candidate for president and he deserves a decent bankroll. Yes, said Framingham. Charlie, you'll have to loosen up. We could never explain nominating a candidate and then cutting off his water. That's right. Cuthbert bid again for compromise. Eddie's already given his word he'll be more cautious about what he says from now on. Heron flicked the ash off his cigarette and stared at Eddie. No more smart-ass cracks about executive suites? He asked after a moment. I'll think carefully about what I say. Okay. Split it. 900,000 for you, 900,000 for Ewing's group. Eddie shook his head. You know that's not fair, Charlie. Sniffing compromise in the air, Stackpole moved at once to bottle it. Make it 1,000,001 for the top candidate, Charlie. That okay with you, Eddie? Quinn nodded. Okay, said Heron grudgingly. 1.1 for Quinn and .7 for Ewing and his people. Stackpole rang for the stewardess, and the settlement was irrigated in scotch, gin, and Eddie's ginger ale. Flying over Virginia, the leaders managed to restore an air of dispassionate purpose to their talk, although Heron did not join in. He appeared to have lost interest in the problems of the candidate. By the time the jet began its letdown for Washington's National Airport, Pete Stackpole was sitting on an aisle armrest and regaling the others with a story of his negotiations with the 3 committee members from Utah. So I said we had the votes for Quinn, but we wanted Utah to have the honor of putting him over. And Corby says, but hell, he never laid eyes on Eddie. And Grace says, oh, I have. He's the one who looks like a state trooper. I said, that's our man. And then Corby wanted to know whether Eddie favored keeping some arsenal out there. And I said, well, look who's backing him, Senator Framingham, and you know that Framingham stand on military bases. Then Grace said he'd go for Eddie if Utah could get a decent break on inauguration tickets. And I said, Grace, honey, when they inaugurate Eddie Quinn, you and your husband can have seats for the parade in the White House pavilion right next to the president's box. Then Corby, with that funny lisp, says about his wife. He trailed off. When the plane landed, the Kingmakers bunched around Eddie and moved in a body of unfractured comradeship. They stood at the top of the ramp while photographers, flashbulbs popped, and several hundred people pressed close to the plane. Then Stackpole led the way down the steps, leaving the candidate the lone target for the photographers, who swore routinely at one another as they jockeyed for position. Eddie waved to the crowd. He felt fine. He had $1.1 million to spend and 18 days in which to do it.